Remus. I'll start over. My name is Ed Remus, and I am an assistant professor and social sciences librarian at Northeastern Illinois University. And the title of my talk is Library Organized Events and Progressive Conservative Polarization. I'll try to make a case for what I'm calling liberal library programming. So I should mention that my talk really is going to be more historical and theoretical. And so some of you might be wondering, what am I even talking about? What are these viewpoint diverse library events? And how would I organize one? Well, I'm going to take just a second here and share with you some links in the chat, because I think some of these will actually be more helpful to you. So I'm putting one link here to show you an example of some of these events. And if you want to look at the slides from today, after this presentation, you'll find some others that I've organized over the years. First at public libraries and then at academic libraries. And I'm also going to provide you all with the conference presentation link. With a link to a conference presentation that I gave last year, in which I really talked about how to organize these events. And so today I'm going to talk mostly about why one would do it, but some of you might actually benefit more from knowing just what they are and how you go about organizing them. So please feel free to check out those links. I want to talk a little bit about some professional guidance we have around library-initiated events. And there's two documents in particular from the American Library Association. One is titled Library-Initiated Programs and Displays as a Resource, an Interpretation of the Library Bill of Rights. And the other is called Responding to and Preparing for Controversial Programs and Speakers Q&A. And I want to draw your attention to two dimensions of these two documents. One, they argue pretty clearly in favor of what we call in our discipline intellectual freedom, and in my sort of historical talk today, I'm going to be calling liberty, that libraries have a responsibility to represent diverse views and avoid bias. Libraries should be proactive and present programs that provide multiple viewpoints, and programs should not be canceled because of the ideas or topics of the program or the views expressed by the participants or speakers, right? Standard intellectual freedom language. But then our documents also advocate in favor of, you could say, social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for today's purposes, I'll be shorthanding that as group democracy, democracy based on the inclusion, the incorporation of potentially or formally excluded social groups. Right, so libraries should actively seek to include a multitude of viewpoints and cultural perspectives that reflect the diversity in our communities, and socially excluded, marginalized, and underrepresented people, not just the mainstream majority, should be able to see themselves reflected in the resources and programs that libraries offer. So this is important to think about intellectual freedom and group democracy, intellectual freedom or liberty, group democracy, or social justice, DEI. These are two major sets of considerations when organizing viewpoint diverse events in the library. And I want to reflect on them a little bit historically. And so I want to take everyone through a sort of quick tour of historical thought on the relationship between democracy and liberty. And I basically want to show that bourgeois era liberals like John Milton recognized that there was a conflict between liberty and specifically majoritarian democracy. In the industrial era, liberals like John Stuart Mill recognized the conflict between liberty and mass democracy. In the totalitarian era, conservatives like James Burnham recognized the conflict between liberty and group-based democracy. In the neoliberal era, progressives, taking cues from Herbert Marcuse, have advocated group-based democracy over liberty. And now neoliberal era and post-neoliberal era conservatives have advocated majoritarian democracy over liberty. And I think that's how I would frame a lot of what was discussed in our opening session, these book bans that are happening a lot. And then also so the upshot of all this is that I think viewpoint diverse library programming could face either or both of these last two conflicts today, right? It can be challenged on the grounds of being too much in favor of liberty and not enough advocating group-based democracy. And it's also challenged, as we heard about in the last session, that it's too much advocating liberty and not enough incorporating the sensibilities of a majoritarian democracy. So just a very quick summary of John Milton. his Aeropagitica, which is certainly worth reading for lovers of free speech and intellectual diversity. He argues that the pursuit of truth requires hearing all manner of reason, and this is the benefit, he writes, which may be had of books promiscuously read. He argues that to be reasonable, true beliefs require trial by contrary beliefs. He argues that true beliefs held without such reason, such trial by contrary beliefs, end up being held based on authority, because everyone thinks so, or some authority figure says so, right? And he argues that no one viewpoint or belief system holds a monopoly on truth. He has a really beautiful analogy or allegory of truth being dismembered and its limbs being scattered throughout the world, and the friends of truth need to search far and wide to gather up the limbs. Now, Milton argues, and he makes some references to classical antiquity to this effect, that majoritarian democracy can threaten liberty. There's a democratic precedent going back to even ancient Athens, which was fairly liberal for the state prohibiting certain ideas, burning books. He thinks that over time, especially in the passage from late antiquity to the Middle Ages and beyond, this became tyrannical. And there's an argument against Parliament subjecting books to pre-publication censorship. And basically part of how he supports that argument is that this is what the popes of Rome ended up doing. And of course, that was a powerful argument in the context of a Protestant audience at that time. And he ultimately argues that even in cases of book burning, that he's, that the last instance of book burning that he mentions is one of individuals deciding to burn their own books. And he seems to suggest, if one is going to burn books, this is how it should be done. But then again, even others might have used those books usefully. This is liberalism of the bourgeois era. After the French Revolution, I should say this is a defense of liberty during the bourgeois era, but liberalism, and here I'm relying on an excellent book by the historian Helena Rosenblatt titled The Lost History of Liberalism from Ancient Rome to the 20th Century. After the French Revolution, liberalism emerges, and the idea is to defend liberty from democracy. Before the 19th century, being liberal meant a kind of noblesse oblige. But it emerged as a defense of kind of Republican principles against the tyranny of the majority, the tyranny of the mob. And so one great quote from Rosenblatt here I'll read. Being liberal was not the same thing as being a Democrat. Today we are so used to speaking of liberal democracy that it is easy to conflate the two terms. During this early period, however, when liberalism was just being born, liberal and democratic principles were often opposed to each other. Certainly neither the early liberals, Benjamin Constant nor Madame de Staël, was a Democrat in our sense of the word, because they viewed the politicized poor as partly responsible for the illiberal terror that followed the French Revolution. So Helena Rosenblatt goes on to show how workers tried to solve the social question of unemployment that emerged after the Industrial Revolution via democratic politics. Majoritarian democracy had always been a threat to liberty, one might argue, but specifically after the Industrial Revolution, it's a threat in a new way, in that citizens without property who need to work for a living but don't have any necessarily guaranteed employment turn to the state, turn to politics to try to address this issue. And the politics they turn to may not necessarily be particularly liberal or Republican in nature, right? And so this is how contemporaries viewed the election and then coup of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Actually, it might have been the other way around, but circa 1848 in France. And so his rule on the basis of this kind of democracy in the capitalist era was new in that it seemed to combine, it was a hybrid type of rule, combined a police state and a welfare state. Napoleon III offered workers an unprecedented range of relief measures through the state, but he used censorship and surveillance to stifle any opposition, and of course reported on all of his great accomplishments in a state-controlled press. So Rosenblatt describes this as a democratic dictatorship, right? So arguably this became a permanent feature of the state in capitalism, right? If we think of subsequent heads of state in Europe and the United States, Otto von Bismarck, Woodrow Wilson, Mussolini, Stalin, FDR, Hitler, Each of these, some obviously much more illiberal than others, but they each combined democratic and often progressive state policies and political support with a greater or lesser degree of illiberalism, a kind of trampling on liberty, trampling on free speech, free exchange of ideas, right? So it's in the face of this when this is starting to take shape, kind of mass democracy, late 19th century, that John Stuart Mill is arguing that liberalism must still defend liberty from democracy. And he makes some of the arguments that John Milton makes. I won't rehearse them all, but he does note that specifically heretical opinions tend to express suppressed or neglected truths. And he argues that minority opinions should be specifically encouraged and countenanced because they represent interests that have been neglected in the context of the politics and society of the time. Now, I want to fast forward a little bit to consider the 20th century, right? With this theme of mass democracy, where does that end up? Well, as we all probably know, the midnight of the 20th century, so to speak, is that mass democracy ends up with in not only fascism, but Nazism. So I want to look at a writing by Herbert Marcuse, an essay from the 1930s titled "The Struggle Against Liberalism and the Totalitarian View of the State." And Marcuse argues that in the era of mass democracy, liberalism came to mean advocating a capitalist structure, right? You want civil liberties, but you also support capitalism. So Marcuse argues that when capitalism entered a deep crisis, this meant that liberalism failed politically. The plausibility of liberalist rationalism, Marcuse writes, ceases immediately when, with the intensification of social conflict and economic crises, general harmony becomes increasingly improbable, rational critique gives up. Now, the Nazis, Marcuse argued, actually made brilliant use of this. They blamed, they were staunchly illiberal, they were deep critics of liberalism, and they sort of saddled liberalism with the blame for capitalism, for capitalist crisis. And at the same time, Marcuse notes, at that time he's writing as a Marxist, when the Nazis took power, they actually continued that capitalist structure in his view. Now, Marcuse sort of shifts from Marxism to progressivism over the course of his life. I want to look at a second 20th century intellectual, James Burnham, who shifts from Marxism to conservatism. And Burnham is looking at the other side, so to speak, of 20th century totalitarianism, namely Stalinism. And here, Burnham sees not necessarily just a mass majoritarian democracy turning illiberal, but a specifically group-based democracy that advances illiberalism. So Burnham thought that liberty requires the right to publicly oppose the governing elite, to speak and organize in opposition to the governing elite. But he argues that a new form of democracy, which I'm calling group democracy, is actually stifling the right of opposition while advancing the interests of previously neglected or excluded social groups, right? So Burnham is very critical of the progressive vice president under FDR, Henry Wallace. And Wallace is working to a large extent with the American Stalinists, American communists, and progressives like Wallace, as well as the American Stalinists, basically argued that in Stalinist Russia, there have been great advances in what Wallace calls ethnic democracy, democracy in the treatment of the sexes, economic democracy, and Wallace acknowledges that that Stalinist Russia is behind in Bill of Rights democracy, what we might call free speech, civil liberties, right? But Wallace argues that this isn't very important, right? And actually, anyway, it can form a block on the advancement of oppressed social groups, right? On the advancement of group democracy. So for Burnham, this is, and really for 20th century conservative thought, I want to suggest this is a really important moment because Burnham is sort of pointing to how there can be an apparent advancement in group democracy in the social political integration of previously oppressed or exploited groups. And at the same time, there can be profound illiberalism, right? The abrogation of civil rights, civil liberties, especially. So Burnham thinks that this is actually fundamental to the totalitarian dynamic in the Soviet Union. Now, by the 1960s, Burnham is writing a book, The Suicide of the West, an essay on the meaning and destiny of liberalism. At this point, he's become considerably more conservative than he was even in the early 1940s when he was writing about the Soviet Union and the passages I just quoted. And here he makes an argument that I have heard, I raise it because I've heard both progressives and conservatives raise this argument that if you allow liberalism, you're merely setting yourself up to be taken advantage of by totalitarians who will use free speech and the open exchange of ideas to bring about an illiberal order, right? And this is what Burnham thinks is happening in the fight against communism. Now, finally, I want to look at Herbert Marcuse. By the 1960s, he writes a very famous essay titled Repressive Tolerance. And he argues that this liberal tolerance for differing viewpoints actually blocks this group-based democracy, right? Because Marcuse's argument is that under liberalism, all views are tolerated, but there are profound structural sources of oppression and discrimination. And the system, moreover, Marcuse argues, precludes individuals' use of reason against oppressive views. It's no longer the case that individuals can be reasoned with and shown, the appeal to reason, as the old socialist newspaper was titled in the early 20th century. The system, through various technological organizational means, has basically blocked that. And so Marcuse argues that true tolerance requires active discrimination against oppressive views. Marcuse writes, tolerance would be restricted with respect to movements of a demonstrably aggressive or destructive character. Such discrimination would be applied to movements opposing the extension of social legislation to the poor, weak, or disabled. I maintain there are issues where the other side, quote unquote, is demonstrably regressive and impedes possible improvement of the human condition. To tolerate propaganda for inhumanity vitiates the goals not only of liberalism, but of every progressive political philosophy. Now, why do we bring this up? Well, because I think that Marcuse has certain inheritors today. There are certain progressives who are very critical of liberalism, what I'm calling liberty or liberalism, who agree that capitalist tolerance blocks the progress of group-based democracy. So on the left is a text against arguing that hate speech and white supremacy should not be protected by the First Amendment. It's co-authored by Richard Delgado, who is a founder of critical race theory. And on the right, in our own discipline, there's a recent book by Sam Popowich, Confronting the Democratic Discourse of Librarianship, a Marxist Approach, that I think basically shares and works with Marcuse's argument. I haven't studied it carefully yet, but I believe that's sort of the broad approach, right? And so the idea here is to work through the state or state-adjacent democratic institutions, we might say, in professions, to disfavor viewpoints that are deemed hateful or harmful to historically oppressed and socially marginalized groups. Now, conservatism has taken note of this, right? Conservatives, there's a strain of conservatism, at least, that agrees with Burnham that group-based democracy advances an illiberal, or what the conservative thinker Paul Gottfried calls a post-liberal statism. Conservatives are very attentive to what they call ideological capture of contemporary institutions. So, for example, a contemporary conservative writer, Christopher Caldwell, argues that he points out that of the librarians who donated to a 2020 US presidential candidate, 93% of us donated to Joe Biden. And so I think this foregrounds, I don't necessarily want to saddle Gottfried with this, but I think this sort of frames why, in the conservative view, they believe it's necessary to work through democratic elections and elected state bodies to disfavor progressive viewpoints deemed by populists to be hateful or harmful to traditional values. Nonetheless, and I want to try to quickly wrap up, there are conservative liberals today. For example, there are some affiliated with the conservative Claremont Institute. I'm thinking of the president of the Academic Freedom Alliance, Lucas Morel, who argue that liberty should be supported. It's part of the American national and or Western civilizational tradition, right? We might not support it for that reason, but there are conservatives who do. And of course, there are conservatives who support liberty on the grounds that progressives have recently attempted to curb conservatives' use of liberty. And then finally, I think we heard a lot of this in the last session, actually. There's a lot of progressive liberalism today, that the idea that group democracy, the advancement of group democracy, requires liberty. Liberty and open discussion exchange is necessary to build and consolidate support for the integration of historically oppressed, socially marginalized groups. And conservatives have historically attempted to curb those groups' use of liberty, including by labeling them hate groups or labeling them harmful, right? And so we need to support liberty to kind of keep this playing field open. And this is a fantastic book, Nadine Strawson, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. So I just want to conclude, after that tour, it may not be clear. I hope it's a little bit suggestive. But I want to conclude by making a minimum argument for liberty and democracy in how we approach library programming. I think, in short, I follow Mill in agreeing that some issues today are controversial in our society and in our politics. Not every issue is, but some definitely are. And some multiple differing viewpoints are widely held on those issues throughout society. And some speakers have authority by virtue of publication experience to address these issues via these differing viewpoints. What I really want to suggest here is that librarians, we have the skills and the institutional positions to curate these issues, to curate these viewpoints, and curate these speakers in the form of public library-initiated events. I think that this work can help to educate individuals. I think there may be an argument that it can help to gain the trust of society in libraries. And finally, this is really the upshot of that historical investigation that I've undertaken. I think that librarians can find support for this work among liberally minded individuals and institutions of various viewpoints, be they progressive, conservative, or potentially neither, simply liberally minded. So that is what I have to present for you all, and I welcome your questions, and I welcome a dialogue. I see a hand raised. I'm not sure if you are all able to. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I just want to sort of.
Yeah. Thank you. So that was that's fascinating viewpoints. Like I had no idea how just how varied liberalism or the different approaches to liberal ideas there could be, and so very thought-provoking presentation. As far as finding perhaps balance, we get told, or I mean, I think nowadays it's less common that libraries are neutral when when we really can't be, as far as everything goes. Um, I guess what should be or what can be our approach to thinking about how we view our collections? I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling at this point.
No, good question. I've given thought to that because that would, I was sort of thinking in anticipation of this presentation that would be an even more robust argument for me to make, to wade into the neutrality debate and say, here's the value with which we should replace neutrality. I would say that my thinking in this argument tends in the direction of liberty, but also democracy. That we could argue that we do to an extent serve majoritarian democracy in very conservative areas. Public libraries hold reading groups of the books by Bill O'Reilly, the conservative cultural commentator. In very progressive areas, public libraries, host sort of anti-racist and DEI-oriented speakers, right? So we serve majoritarian democracy. We also, as I tried to suggest, serve a kind of group democracy, right? The post-civil rights movement structure based on integrating historically oppressed and marginalized groups. This is another form of democracy we serve. But alongside democracy, I do think there's an enduring value, and I think this is in part what was historically meant by neutrality, in liberty, in trying to encourage the countenancing of the very widest possible range of viewpoints and arguments. So I think we could potentially replace neutrality with liberty, and I think our democratic commitments would not be far behind. I think I would also point out that there's a slight distinction between liberty and liberalism, in the sense that liberalism emerges as a political philosophy and approach in the 19th century. And before too long, it gets sort of caught up, as I've tried to show, it gets sort of implicated within varieties of capitalist politics, or an approach to the kind of state management of the social turmoil that ensues in post-industrial revolution capitalism. So it might be a little bit of a cop-out, but there is a kind of bourgeois gesture to suggesting liberty over liberalism, to suggesting that ultimately we may want to go back before the consolidation of a distinctive liberal tradition that has managerial implications today of trying to sort of manage social conflict, and sort of return to an earlier point of simply the open investigation that both individuals and society seem to require. I apologize if that's a little bit convoluted, but yeah, in short, liberty. Think about liberty.
Thank you.
I could start to look at questions in the chat, but others should feel free to unmute. I'd be happy to receive questions, comments, criticisms. I do see a challenging question here, presenting multiple points of view when one viewpoint is rooted in violence against a group. Yeah, I mean that I do think that viewpoints tend to be framed that way. And I guess here I'm sympathetic to something that I think Emily Knox may have said at some point previously, that, you know, the standard on the one hand, at least for use of library space, could be and should be a kind of imminent threat of violence. But on the other hand, that's different from including a viewpoint in a library-initiated program. I guess what I would say is that this is where I find Mill helpful. Not all issues are very widely controversial. You know, some progressives might argue that the endpoint of conservatism is a white racial ethno-state that would set up concentration camps for non-white people. But very few people would actually advocate that. Very few conservatives would advocate that. Conservatives might say that the endpoint of progressivism is a kind of Maoist-style cultural revolution in which anyone with any inherited privilege would be sort of re-educated and forcibly dispossessed. Again, very few progressives would actually advocate that. So I do think if we can actually lean on democracy in our curation, and by that I mean we can ask with Mill, is it not the case that some ideas are no longer really controversial? Is it not the case that most people agree that there shouldn't be a white ethno-state or a Maoist-style cultural revolution? Is it not the case that, you know, most people disagree over things like, you know, like how immigration should be limited, or whether affirmative action should be expanded or kept as is, or sort of closed down, right? Those would be examples of some debates that sort of touch on issues of violence. You know, they could be portrayed as like opening onto violence against groups. Certainly they involve the state. That is a fact. They involve perhaps the most inherently violent institution. But nonetheless, there are pretty clear identifiable viewpoints that are commonly held on those issues. And fortunately, I'd like to think it's not the case that it's a very widely held viewpoint that you know, imminent violence should be done to any particular group. If that were to become the case, then, you know, then we have some real quandaries, right? What would we do if there were literal totalitarianism, be it of an ostensibly left-wing or right-wing variety rising? But I think short of that, we can sort of fall back on the notion that we're going to curate widely held viewpoints on recognizably controversial topics. And I am a little bit concerned, I should add to that, that I do think there's a tendency, because we are justifiably concerned about, you know, encouraging views that could lead to violence. I think we may, as a profession, be missing an opportunity to curate viewpoints that don't really tend in that direction. I think it would be unfortunate if we shirked before the possibility of, as a profession, curating and hosting a wide range of discussions and debates in public across the country, across our academic and school and public library institutions, for fear that to do so would inherently involve giving direct incitement to violence. I personally don't think that it would, although I think that's an important concern. I am again only seeing the questions in the chat, and I don't want to eat into others' presentations as well, but I guess I'll assume maybe I could ask the moderator, should we wrap up? I'd be happy to stay around, but at the same time, out of respect to those presenting in the next session, I don't know if that would be appropriate. Yeah, I think I'll go ahead and just call it out of respect to those who are presenting in the next session. I don't want to make anyone late. So thank you all very much. And the last thing I will say is I'm a member of an organization called Heterodox Academy Libraries. If you Google Heterodox Academy Libraries, we're a group of sort of viewpoint diverse librarians who are interested in viewpoint diversity. We are specifically academic librarians, but we would welcome the participation. I think there are actually some public librarians among us. And if anyone of you is interested in a community of practice, I'd be very happy to see you in our activities. And I'm going to just put my email address in the chat. And you can feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk. I'd be happy to provide any guidance. I see this as part of my professional practice. So if I could inspire or troubleshoot or just workshop with any of you, it would really be my pleasure. So thank you for your time and attention today, and I'll leave it there. And once again, I am going to wrap up here. I think I may end the event at this point out of respect to those who are presenting next. So I'd encourage you all to go ahead and sign out, and please join the presentations now underway by some of our colleagues.